Welcome to this explainer. I'm absolutely thrilled you're tuning in today because honestly, we're looking at one of the most incredible, multi-layered, and frankly mind-blowing 2,000-year histories on the entire planet. We're talking about Madagascar. Now, this isn't just a story about some isolated landmass. Oh no, it is an epic saga of oceanic voyagers, fierce monarchs, massive anti-colonial uprisings, and a modern-day struggle for true sovereignty. We're going to cover the whole shebang, from the very foundation of Madagascar right up to the headlines you're seeing today.
Okay, so let's dive into this. If I asked you right now who the first people to settle Madagascar were, you'd probably just look at a map, see the island sitting right next to the eastern coast of Africa, and assume, well, it was settled by neighboring African populations. Right? I mean, it makes total geographical sense. But history rarely follows a straight line. And the true foundation of Madagascar? It completely turns that assumption on its head.
Recent genetic and archaeological data reveals an absolutely staggering number: 30. Yep, you heard that right. Madagascar was likely founded over 1,200 years ago by a remarkably small group of roughly 30 women. And here's the truly wild part. 93% of these women were of Southeast Asian descent, specifically from Borneo in modern-day Indonesia. They literally sailed thousands of miles across the Indian Ocean in outrigger canoes. It's hands down one of the greatest feats of prehistoric navigation, and it completely forged the unique genetic and cultural blueprint of the Malagasy people.
So, to really understand how this all evolved, we're going to follow a bit of a roadmap today. We'll track the journey of those first voyagers, see how the highlands were unified, look at the intense fight for sovereignty and survival, cover the French invasions, and finally unpack what independence and modern struggles look like today.
All right, let's start at the very beginning with those first voyagers making their way from Borneo and the rise of the Vizimba.
You see, the Malagasy identity is this beautiful, unique product of centuries of interaction. You've got those incredible Austronesian seafarers mixing with later Bantu migrants from East Africa. Between 500 and 200 BCE, the first Austronesians arrived. Then, by around 600 CE, these early settlers started migrating inland, clearing the highland forest to plant crops like taro and rice. Fast forward a bit to the 10th and 11th centuries, and new waves are arriving on the west coast. This included Arabic and Zanzibari slavers coming down the Swahili coast, bringing Islamic influences that further layered the island's incredibly diverse ethnic makeup.
Now, out of those early inland migrations emerged a group known in oral history as the Vizimba. They are the historical and sometimes kind of mythical first inhabitants of the highlands. They lived in deep isolation as hunter-gatherers, practicing slash-and-burn agriculture, and there's this really fascinating detail about their culture. They herded zebu, which is a type of cattle brought over by later arrivals, but they didn't actually eat them for meat. Eventually, the Vizimba were assimilated, sometimes peacefully, sometimes by force, into newer, more technologically advanced groups. And that really laid the foundational roots of the modern Malagasy identity.
Moving right along, let's look at how the island's center of power shifted with the unification of the highlands and the dramatic rise of the Merina Kingdom.
So, as populations grew, the political landscape got a lot more complex. But the real consolidation of power, that happened in the Central Highlands. And it took a grueling 77-year civil war to get there. In the late 1700s, King Andrea Nampuin Merina stepped up with a massive ambition for total unification. He famously declared, "The sea is the boundary of my rice field." Talk about a mic drop, right? He didn't just conquer rival princes, he fundamentally organized the state. He oversaw the building of massive dikes and trenches to increase arable land and put an end to decades of famine. He codified laws, and he even expanded traditional rituals to create a state religion, with himself right at the center, of course, to legitimize his rule. By the time he died in 1810, the groundwork to unify all of Madagascar was firmly in place.
But unifying an island is one thing. Keeping it is another. That brings us to a critical era of sovereignty and survival, caught in a tug-of-war between modernization and isolation.
So the Merina Kingdom is expanding, but there's a massive ideological clash brewing. European empires, specifically the British and the French, were aggressively circling the island. They were hungry for influence, resources, and strategic control over the Indian Ocean. This pressure led to a dramatic split in leadership styles. On one hand, you had King Radamana I. He totally embraced modernization, signed treaties with the British, and welcomed European missionaries to teach literacy and tradecraft. But when he died, Queen Ranavalona I took over and completely reversed course. She was fiercely isolationist. She expelled the missionaries, restricted European trade, and actively fought tooth and nail to maintain Malagasy sovereignty without any foreign interference.
She once stated, I do not feel any shame or fear about my ancestors' customs. And honestly, that perfectly captures her 33-year reign. She successfully prevented European colonization during her lifetime, which was an incredibly rare feat for an African state in the 19th century. However, we have to look at the whole picture. That independence came at a staggering internal cost. To build with a massive standing army and complete her public works, she relied heavily on something called finampuana, which was a really harsh system of forced labor. Combine that with constant warfare, disease, and incredibly strict judicial practices, and the island's population is actually estimated to have declined by half during the 1830s. It's a deeply complex legacy of fierce independence tangled up with authoritarian rule.
And that precarious balance couldn't last forever, which leads us to the creeping shadow of the French invasions and the ultimate fall of the monarchy.
Following Queen Ranavallona's death, the monarchy tried desperately to play the British and French against each other through diplomacy. But the scramble for Africa was just too powerful, and it finally overpowered the island. It happened in quick succession. Step 1, in 1883, France demanded concessions and invaded the coast. Step 2, by 1890, European politics sealed Madagascar's fate when the British agreed to recognize a French protectorate, basically trading it for British control over Zanzibar. And Step 3, in 1895, a French flying column marched right on the capital, Antananarivo. Just like that, the 103-year-old Merina monarchy was dissolved. The last queen, Ranavallona III, was exiled to Algeria, and Madagascar officially became a French colony.
But listen, the Malagasy people did absolutely not just quietly accept colonial rule. Almost immediately, we see the outbreak of the Menelamba, or Red Shawl Rebellion. And what's crucial here is that this wasn't led by the exiled royalty. No, this was a fierce guerrilla uprising by common peasants. Their motivations were crystal clear. They entirely rejected French rule and European Christianity, demanding a return to ancestor veneration. And, perhaps most importantly, they were violently rejecting that heavy burden of corvée labor, the forced labor that both the traditional Malagasy state and the new colonial powers had relied upon. They'd had enough.
That resistance simmered and eventually boiled over decades later into the devastating Malagasy uprising of 1947. The human cost here is just heartbreaking. An estimated 100,000 lives were lost. French colonial forces used brutal, vindictive suppression tactics. We're talking mass arrests, executions, and the literal razing of entire villages. It stands as one of the most violent suppressions anywhere in the colonial world, and it left a deep, enduring scar on the nation's history.
So, how do we get from that dark chapter to where we are today? Let's dive into independence, modern struggles, and how this long legacy lives on.
In 1960, Madagascar was finally granted independence. But here's the catch. The island remained heavily tied to French economic interests. Even after independence, half of the island's exports and imports were still tied up with their former colonial power. The finance capital and the banking sector? Largely controlled by French institutions. So while political independence had been achieved on paper, true economic sovereignty was still vastly out of reach.
Now you might be wondering, why does this matter to us right now? Well, it matters because this historical thread leads directly into today's headlines. Take the recent Leo de Lajdas protests, for example. Citizens are rising up over devastating 12-hour electricity cutoffs. The sources trace the roots of this deeply impoverished economy and crumbling infrastructure right back to the colonial era. It goes back to those extraction policies and the failure to develop sustainable systems for the Malagasy people themselves. Those historical grievances about forced labor, capital control, and massive inequality, they aren't just history. They are actively sparking protests today.
Which leaves us with this final thought. Madagascar has been called the Island of Waves. And when you look at its history, you see exactly why. Waves of Austronesian voyagers, waves of Arab traders and Bantu migrants, waves of monarchical conquests, and waves of European imperialism. They've all crashed onto these shores, shaping an incredibly resilient and unique people. But as the Malagasy continue to protest for basic infrastructure and economic control today, we really have to ask ourselves, will Madagascar's next historical wave finally be one of true, fully realized independence? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. I really hope you're leaving with a much deeper appreciation for this incredible island. See you next time.